The following is an interview with Dr. George Miller, Professor of Psychology at Rockefeller University. Dr. Miller, a theoretical and experimental psychologist, speaks on psycholinguistics. He is the author of the significant paper entitled The Magical Number 7 Plus or Minus 2. The interview is conducted by Dr. Christopher Evans, Secretary of the Brain Research Association. Dr. Evans speaks first.
Professor Miller, lots of people feel that psychology has made disappointing progress in 100 years, and even disappointing progress in the last 20 years or so. Do you subscribe to that view, or do you think that's an unfair statement of the evolution of psychology?
I subscribe to it on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. On Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I don't. When I was a younger psychologist than I am now, I used to read a good deal in the history of psychology. I found it encouraged me. When I went back and saw how ignorant they really were, I realized that we had learned something, although so much of what we learn seems like common sense. I don't read as much in the history of psychology now as I used to, because I've now lived through about 30 years of it, and I can sit and recollect instead of having to read somebody else's account. When I went to Harvard, 1942 or so, as a graduate student, I was into experimental psychology. That was very, very scientific. And in those days, I remember we were much worried, very, very self-conscious as to whether psychology was a science or not. We were, in those days, under the influence of the positivism of the Vienna Circle, and it was very fashionable to be a science. Today, it doesn't seem quite as fashionable to be a science as it did 3 or 4 years ago, but the logicians and philosophers of science seemed to have definitions of science in those days that defined it practically as an experiment endeavor, so that we used to debate, I remember, as to whether mathematics was a science, because they didn't really collect any empirical or experimental information. And of course, even astronomy and economics were questionable, and because they could not control the variables. They simply had to sit and wait and see what happened. And of course, history couldn't be a science, and if history is not a science, then of course the whole clinical method that so many psychologists use was not a science. So I was raised in a very narrow notion, and you scored points for being a scientist. It was sort of a game, and there seemed to be rules, and if you followed those rules, you could be a scientist. And almost every introductory textbook of psychology in those days started off with a chapter entitled "What is Science?", the purpose of which was to persuade the student that he was studying a real science. Today, thank goodness, we're not nearly as concerned about our scientific purity as we used to be.
One thing that I've heard a lot of people say is that it's a great pity that psychology, really in the 19th century, was so anxious to convert itself into a science, or rather to persuade its members that it was scientific. And this led to people becoming really second-rate physiologists and second-rate mathematicians instead of what they should be, really, psychologists.
I think I believe that. The physicists have the notion that there are only two kinds of science. There's physics and stamp collecting, and all of the rest of us kept trying to pull ourselves up to this wonderful level that the theoretical and experimental physics had established. And of course, when psychology first started thinking of itself as a science, physics was the model, experimental physics in particular, and Wundt cast it in that mold, and it persisted. I grew up. I'm one of Wundt's great-great-grandchildren. From Wundt to Titchener to Boring to Stevens to Miller is a direct line of descent, and I'm very conscious of it. But I've fallen by the wayside in recent years. I've gotten to the point of view that I'm going to do the things I can do and do them as well as I can, and if it's science, that's very good, and if it's not science, well, that's too bad. Particularly when you get interested in language, as I have, you begin mixing it up with humanists and grammarians and philologists and all kinds of people whose scientific status are is rather questionable. And I find them just as sharp as the scientists I know and as full of interesting ideas. And I see there's a lot that you can do to understand how the human mind and the human brain work. When I was a graduate student, I couldn't use the word mind. Now I use it quite freely. But originally it was a four-letter Anglo-Saxon word, and to be banned from all serious discussions of the subject. Today it's perhaps an intervening variable if you wanted to make it sound impressive.
In the 40s and even in the early 50s, there was a sort of feeling that hard and fast behaviorism, the sort of emphasis of the physical sciences, was winning and ultimately would win totally. Now, I wonder when you feel that there began the swing of the pendulum in the other direction, or when the turning point, so that mind started to become a decent word again, actually began.
I would relate it to the intrusion of the computer on the psychologist's thought. Clark Hull, who was one of the emperors of psychology in its behavioristic heyday in the United States, used to build little models of capacitors and resistors that would discharge at various rates and that would demonstrate principles of Pavlovian conditioning. And apparently the point of this exercise was that the principles he was talking about could be realized in physical shape, so that it made it seem much more real if you could point to a process out in the physical world that had the same characteristics as the theory that you were espousing. As the computer came in, however, it became possible to formulate realizable models of processes an order of magnitude, 2-3 orders of magnitude more complex than any psychologist who wished to be a self-conscious scientist could ever allow himself prior to that time. So the computers influence psychology in at least two different ways. In the usual way, it has been used as a tool in data analysis and in the control of experiments. But it has influenced it perhaps more importantly in an indirect way. The metaphorical computer, the computer as a way of describing complex systems, I think has perhaps done more to change psychology than has the actual hardware itself. This, of course, came in first, I think, influenced psychology through servo systems, negative feedback type engineering that became very important during the Second World War. And I was fortunate enough to be working with engineers at that time and knew a good deal about it, so that when these ideas appeared, I could adopt them into my thinking a year or two ahead of my colleagues, I guess. Also, out of that general background came information theory from Norbert Wiener, and in the form I studied it most closely from Claude Shannon. And information theory was also a very surprising idea to psychologists, that you might be able to measure something as intangible as the amount of information in a message or in any stimulus event. The feedback ideas, however, I think are still, psychologists are still discovering the power of them and learning to think of a behaving organism as a system that is trying to control its input, and not as a system that takes an input, goes through some reflex, either innate or acquired, and gives an output in the early notion of the telephone switchboard model of the mind. But once you start thinking of it as a loop in which the output is intended to control the input, and I mean that quite literally, that as I move my head around, I change my view of the world, and all the way from sensory adaptations at that level to the question of changing my sensations of my stomach when I'm hungry. These are very important ideas. In fact, the feedback principle is one of the few general principles that neurophysiologists and experimental psychologists have to call on.
One thing that you said was very interesting, that everyone was very surprised, particularly, psychologists were very surprised at the notion that one could measure something as intangible as information. Now, one of the reasons that the word mind was such an improper word, I think, was that psychologists honestly felt that it too was intangible and therefore couldn't be measured. Do you think that this insight that information was measurable somehow allowed psychologists to be more broad-minded about other kinds of things that they could measure?
I'm sure that's so. The mind fell into disrepute due to its invisibility. Well, what is the basic idea in information measurement? The notion is that if an event occurs as one of two possible events that might occur, the occurrence of that event being more predictable is less informative than if the event were one out of, say, thousands of alternative things that might have happened. If you're expecting any one of 1,000 things, you're very ignorant of what will happen, and when it happens, you get quite a lot of information. And this is a very powerful notion. I can remember getting quite excited about it. It has to do with what the person expects. You see, you can present over a noisy telephone line a word like any word you like, dog, say, take a common English monosyllable, and you can arrange the signal-to-noise ratio in such a way that the noise power is about 4 times as great as the speech power. And under those conditions, if you know in advance that the word you're going to hear is one of two, either dog or cat, you can recognize correctly which it is about 95 to 100% of the time. But if I tell you that you're going to hear an English monosyllable, which might be one of 2,000 or 3,000 alternatives, and I present to you exactly the same stimulus condition, your probability of hearing dog correctly will be of the order of 5 to 10%. Now, the physical stimulus in both cases is exactly the same. The only thing that has changed is the listener's expectation. And that expectation is reflected in the probability of occurrence of the various stimuli. And the probability of occurrence of events is exactly what information theory is about. The measure of information theory is the mean logarithmic probability. And that is the same thing that physicists use to measure entropy. The improbability of a state of matter, and you can talk in the same way about the improbability of the input to a human organism. And with that idea, we suddenly had another dimension for all of our studies. You know, we'd always used things like time and space as variables that we wanted to measure to characterize behavior, but here was another variable that we'd been ignoring based on probability, on expectation. And it would have been rejected in the old days as being too highly teleological. Expectations are invisible, and you're not supposed to explain present behavior in terms of future events. It seems to reverse the whole nature of science to do that. But that's the kind of a thing that an organism is, and if an organism weren't that kind of a thing, an organism wouldn't have survived the evolutionary process to be here today. So it is built in. The work by Wiener and Rosenbluth and Bigelow on how purpose could be built into feedback systems, the work by Wiener and Shannon on information theory, these were tremendously important influences on my thinking, and I believe that they have influenced the field generally.
I think you yourself published one of the most influential papers in the mid-1950s, which very many people are familiar with, and that was the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. It was a very witty paper, but also I felt a very incisive one, and one that made me, in a sense, switched me on to thinking about information theory. Would you mind, can we discuss this? What gave you the idea to write that paper, and perhaps you could discuss what you were saying in the paper?
It's really 2 papers, and it's remarkable to me how few people ever noticed that it was 2 papers. Historically, it developed out of an invitation to give an invited address, an hour-long address, to the Eastern Psychological Association. And when I received the invitation, I was overwhelmed with the importance and the significance of this, and I wanted to do a good job. But I didn't have enough material to give a whole hour's talk on. So what I did was to refuse the invitation. But I wrote such a long letter of refusal that the inviter said, well, obviously you're interested in doing this, now come on and do it. So finally I did it, and I did it by putting together 2 lines of research, one on absolute judgment and the other on short-term memory. And the only thing I could find that related those 2 bits of research that I was involved in at the time was the fact that 7 seemed to be important in both of them. And so that's how 7 became the title. And at the present time, I think I'm the only psychologist in the world who owns a number, because every time 7 is mentioned, they seem to refer to me. This has its advantages and its disadvantages. The work on absolute judgment, and let me try to state it clearly, if I can, this many years later, involved judgments of unidimensional stimuli. And I've learned to say that loud and clear now. It does not mean that you can only distinguish one from among 7 alternative things in the world. What it means is that if you have to judge something or a set of stimuli that differ from each other in only one respect, such as their pitch, or all of the same loudness and same tonal quality, but their pitch differs, say. Or if you have to judge little spots of light which vary only in their brightness, but their color remains constant and their size remains constant. If it's a unidimensional judgment, then it does seem to be very difficult to make accurate estimates of the magnitudes involved beyond discrimination at about 5 to 9 levels that you can reliably recognize whenever they occur. And this seemed like a very odd limitation on information processing. The moral I tried to draw was that the organism, the human organism at any rate, is not designed to make accurate judgments along any one dimension. It seems to be designed to make accurate judgments of configurations of dimensions. And in order to do that, you may need to know only that something is present or absent. You don't have to judge whether it is there at level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That was one line of work that went into the magical 7, plus or minus 2. The other line of work was short-term memory, and it had been known since Galton, I believe, that the average person can remember in correct order and without error a string of about 7 digits after hearing them once, and can repeat them back in the correct order. And that was used in intelligence tests. It's not really a good intelligence test item, because if you have a long span of memory, it doesn't mean that you're very bright, but if you have a very short one, only 2 or 3, then there's probably something seriously wrong with you neurologically. And it had been around for a long time. Wundt had used it. In fact, Wundt made many of the same observations about it that I made, as to how you could extend the span of immediate memory by grouping rhythmically in various ways. But being influenced by computers, even in those days, I had walked into a computer center and seen rows of lights that were on or off, and I couldn't make anything of it. And the engineers who were running the computers seemed to be able to read them off and write them down and talk about them, and I obviously inquired how they did that. And they did it by grouping the lights into threes and recoding into base 8 arithmetic, octal form. That's so commonplace nowadays that it would hardly seem like a discovery to anyone, but it was a discovery to me. So I went back to the laboratory and tried measuring the memory span for sequences of items consisting, let's say, of A and B, or 0 and 1. And if you have to remember a sequence like 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, it gets very, very difficult and you get confused. But if you can group them, 0, 1, 0 is what is it? 2, I guess, isn't it? 0, 1, 1 is 3, and 1, 0, 0 is 4, and 1, 1, 0 is 6, and 1, 1, 1 is 7. If you can group them into digits, and then each digit represents 3, each octal digit represents 3 binary digits, you can remember about 3 times as many as you could otherwise. And this seemed to me to be quite a general principle. Even though you can only remember 7 things, by grouping, you can pack quite a lot more information into those 7 things. So the interesting thing that came out of it, and the problem I tried to present to my colleagues at the time, was that on the sensory judgments, we seem to be limited by the number of bits of information that the stimulus encoded, whereas on the memory side, we seem to be limited only by the number of chunks, and the number of alternatives per chunk didn't seem to be an important consideration. And I left this as sort of a problem to be worked out. Well, a lot of work has been done on it since, and we now know that, in particular, we know that short-term memory is a much more complicated thing than I understood it to be in the middle 50s. But the message that apparently went out to people who heard about the paper without perhaps studying it as carefully as I'd hoped was that the human mind is limited to 7 items at a time. Now, this is exactly what I was not saying, of course. I was saying that you can look at this in a bit way and you can look at it in a chunk way, but items of information, who knows what an item of information is? A sentence may have in it 10 words, 15 syllables, 35 phonemes. How many items of information in a sentence? It may have only 2 ideas in it, and what measure you use in terms of chunks is a very moot point. Well, one amusing thing that's happened to me just the past year, there was in this country during Johnson's administration a Beautification Act passed by Congress, which was known as the Lady Bird Johnson Act. And one of the hopes was that they would take down most of the billboards that disfigured the countryside across the nation. Under this stimulation, a great many people got interested in taking down billboards, and one group of people wrote a little book called Street Graphics. The author of the book wanted to explain why you should take down signboards, and he did so in terms of a notion of information overload for a driver of an automobile. And this was an obvious safety hazard. And his system of measuring signs was that no sign should have more than, I think it was 9 items of information. And in the course of introducing this, he cited, guess what, George Miller's magical number 7. And of course this was exactly what I was not saying. Well, this little book was very widely published in the United States, much to the distress of the Outdoor Advertising Association. And I understand that I was enjoying a career that I knew nothing about in the billboard industry, where they found me anathema. It just happened that I discovered this because somebody in the business happened to be married to a psychologist. And she said, "I don't think that's what Dr. Miller said." And her husband called me up, and he works for the Outdoor Advertising Association, and showed me this book. And I wrote a letter trying to explain the situation just to protect my own scientific reputation. Well, now I seem to be the bête noire of the beautification people and the hero of the signboard people. And all I wanted to do was to make it clear that the work I did in the middle 50s was not relevant to the sort of problem of information processing that a driver faces when he's driving a car through a forest of billboards. We didn't consider the rate of information input at all. Each event was an absolute judgment, and the person had as much time as he wanted to make it as accurately as he could. Well, the one is always a captive of one's past, and so I find myself returning to the magical number 7 on occasions like this, whether I want to or not. I think it was an important period, though, in experimental psychology, and today when bright young students come along, it's perfectly obvious to them that when you ask a person to make a discriminative judgment of some sort, the size of the set of alternatives that he must choose from is obviously a variable that you have to control. And this is so obvious to them that they cannot believe that there was a time when psychologists didn't take that for granted.
After the impact of information theory in the 50s, let's say, the next interesting intrusion into psychology and something that gave it a lift, as far as one can make out, was the increasing interest that psychologists began to pay to linguistics, to the nature of language and the nature of human communication. Do you think this has been a particularly useful injection from outside?
Well, it's certainly been useful in this country. Of course, there's a long tradition in Europe of psychological interest in language. Wundt regarded his best work as the Volkspsychologie, and he was quite a sophisticated linguist. Karl Bühler, did excellent work on it. The Sterns did excellent work on the development of language. But in this country, when we went into our behavioristic period following J.B. Watson, language became sort of a problem for behaviorists, and they had to treat it rather gingerly and took some rather strange points of view toward it. On the one hand, they wanted to say that thinking was just talking to yourself, and talking was an observable behavioral process which they felt they should be able to study. Language, they thought, was one of those mythological things like the mind. But speech, they wanted to study, and yet those who tried to study it carefully discovered it was much more complicated than any sort of theory from Pavlovian stimulus-response reflexological ideas could possibly cope with. So it did liven things up in American psychology quite a bit when we began to think that we could work with language if we were willing to give up some of our scientific sanitization that went along with reflexes. The exciting thing to me was to discover Noam Chomsky. He was just what I needed at the time. You see, one application of information theory is to continuous messages. It isn't just applicable to isolated events in the way I was talking about it before, but you can use the context of a message to predict what can come next. And if you look at that from a probabilistic point of view, it gives you some way to understand why a well-formed grammatical sentence is much easier to hear in the presence of noise, say, than is an equally long string of words that are haphazardly arranged. And so I spent several years of my life studying the transitional probabilities between words. And it was clear to me even then that this was a very difficult enterprise. The most obvious problem was that I couldn't see how a child in a finite childhood could learn all the transitional probabilities that would be involved in generating grammatical sentences. I think I calculated at one time that if he learned one probability per second all day long, 24 hours a day, never sleeping, at the end of 100 years, he still wouldn't have learned a thousandth of what he would need to know all of the 10-word sentences in English. So there was clearly something wrong with that as a psychological model, but of course it was never intended as a psychological model. It was clear that children, as they acquired a language, were not acquiring probabilities of transitions between successive phonemes or between successive words. They were learning a set of rules.
Can I just interrupt too, because this business of transitional probabilities is not a frightfully easy concept to grasp unless one's been thinking about this. Could you explain a little bit more detail what's really meant by that?
Well, given that you have started into a sentence with, say, 3 or 4 words, the words that you have already uttered will limit the options that are open to you to continue the sentence. Now, in some cases, it limits it quite severely. If I say he was one of, then you know pretty well it's going to be the or those or them, a small set of words that can continue. If I say what he saw was a, at that point, you can continue with almost any noun, not any word, with any word that describes a seeable thing. So, in some context, the constraints on what can come next are very powerful. And if you average this out, I think it turns out that it's something of the order of each word is chosen from an average of about 10 possible words, sometimes being thousands and sometimes being only one. If you say hermetically, then the only thing that seems to follow that is sealed in most people's speech. So on the average, each word is chosen not as if it were one from several 100,000 possible English words, but as if it were one from about 10 words. And the question is, how does a child learn what the possible continuations are? That is, what words are probable given the context that has preceded it. And that is called a transitional probability. And if he learns just on the basis of what's probable, as if he was rolling dice in his head to choose successive words, he'll have to learn a lot, and just an enormous number of transitional probabilities, since there's such an enormous number of possible contexts. And if you perform calculations on that, you discover that the child in the 3 or 4 years that he has before he becomes a reasonably competent speaker of the language simply could not learn a language in that way. And so you assume he must be learning it some other way. And one suggestion was that he's learning the rules for putting these things together. That is, that sentences must have subjects and verbs and objects, and that there are certain types of syntactic or grammatical constructions that are acceptable and certain kinds that aren't. And at just that time, when I was seeing that really what I wanted to study was not probability but grammar, I was fortunate enough to encounter Noam Chomsky. I'd heard from a great many linguists that the analysis of language was like a mathematical science, but I'd never discovered any linguistic analysis that seemed to me to even approach the kind of accuracy and precision of mathematics until I met Noam. And since I came to the whole problem with a strong engineering mathematical bent, I was particularly attracted to his work, in which he adopted various of the devices of, E.L. Post, really, the logician, so-called post-production systems, which is ways of describing derivations in logic. Noam Chomsky adopted these to a way of thinking about sentences as if they were being derived from an underlying postulate by a set of rules. And putting it in that way, I could contrast it with the sort of transitional probability model that I had been working with and see what a limited model that was. And it opened up a great many alternative kinds of mathematical formalizations. And that was how I got caught in the linguistics business. When I first became interested in Chomsky's models, of course, I was concentrating entirely, as he does, on the syntactic structure of well-formed sentences. And I spent 7 years, I seem to be plagued by 7, I spent 7 years trying to study how the syntactic rules were used to affect the way people could perceive sentences, the way they could remember sentences, the way they could understand sentences. And we always found that there were effects. Certainly a grammatical sentence is easier to understand than an ungrammatical one, and certain constructions are more difficult to deal with than simpler constructions. But I kept finding over and over again that it was not just the syntactic shape of the sentence, it was what the sentence meant that was really the important variable. I remember I used to talk to students, I used to lecture to students on these ideas, and I would say, now, there are sentences like, strings of words like this, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, that clearly mean nothing at all, even though they seem to have a grammatical form. And the students would object to this, and they'd say, oh, I can understand that, and then they would go into some elaborate search for context in which it might make sense to say something like colorless green ideas sleep furiously. And in fact, one person even wrote a sonnet in which that was the last line, to prove that the human mind was not limited in the way that I seem to find it. And after resisting this struggle for meaning that seemed to be the natural intuitive response to syntax on the part of my students, after resisting that for several years, I finally decided that the students are right, and that is what goes on when you hear a sentence. You look around very hard to see how that fits into your understanding of the context in which it's uttered. Or if you hear it out of context, you try to imagine a context in which it could be said. If somebody says to you, John and Mary saw the Rocky Mountains flying to California, you know perfectly well it was John and Mary who were flying to California, not the Rocky Mountains, although it's perfectly ambiguous as a syntactic structure as to which was flying. You simply know too much about mountains and about people, and which is the more likely to be flying at any particular time. And semantic considerations seem to be important, and so after years of resisting it, I finally decided I would try to understand the psychology of meaning. I find now, as I've been working on meaning for several years, that processes that you have to study are not limited to the kind of meanings that you might look up in a dictionary. Your whole range of conceptual knowledge is available to you, and available to you in a remarkably short period of time after hearing a particular word or a particular phrase, a particular sentence. And how the human memory could be organized to make all of that information available so rapidly is an absolutely astounding problem. When you try to put it, say, in terms of how you would program a computer to do these things, it has to be a very large, very fast computer with an enormous memory, organized in ways that we don't understand at all. And it makes me feel that there must be very important principles to discover from the way the human brain works that might lead to revolutions of a sort I can't even imagine in our design of computers. So, beyond semantics, having gone from sensory signals to probability theory to syntax to semantics, I now find that what some philosophers call pragmatics is really the field of central interest for a psychologist. And pragmatics involves the study of the whole social situation. And you can take any kind of a sentence, you try to imagine what sort of information processing a person does when he hears that sentence. You're forced to realize that what he will do with the sentence depends on the situation in which he hears it. For instance, if I tell you that John drinks wine, you may be able to hear it perfectly. You can look up every word in your mental dictionary. You know what it means. You know who John is, what wine is, what drinking is. You parse it, you put it all together. You could paraphrase the sentence. You could do all of those things, and yet you don't have the foggiest idea what I mean when I say John drinks wine. That is, am I warning you that he's drunk? Am I issuing a promise that you might get some if you go to visit him? Am I telling you something about his personality? What am I doing when I say John drinks wine? And the kind of information processing you will do, what inferences you will draw from a sentence like that, depends as much on the context in which it's uttered and what you perceive that the speaker wants you to believe that he believes, as it does on what the actual words in the sentence are. And that is a study that takes the psychology of language back into the study of the psychology of the mind quite generally.
How would you set about, or how are you setting about studying linguistics within the setting of psychology?
Well, I've spent about 2 years now trying to develop in a coherent fashion some ideas I have about the information processing that goes on when a person hears a sentence. And I'm now about ready to try to test some of those ideas to get out of my armchair. And it seems to me that there's 3 ways you can test them. There is the usual way that psycholinguists use of getting adults, usually college sophomores, and asking them puzzling questions and seeing how long it takes them to figure out the answer. And that's very good, and a lot of people are doing that, and I will probably continue to do it too. But there are 2 other techniques that fascinate me very much. One is to look and see whether the general components of meaning that we find in our analysis of English are also discoverable in exotic languages, languages that have no historical relation to English at all. I suspect that the same concepts are universal. That is, I believe in the psychic unity of mankind. But that they may be packaged into lexical entries very differently in some languages from the way they are in English. But that if you did the same kind of analysis we're doing for English, you should come up with the same kind of concepts, and they are the universal concepts that have fascinated philosophers from the Greeks on, concepts of space and time and causality and motion. These are the things that are built deep into the structure of our language, and the things that provide the context for everything else we talk about. So one way to do it would be to try to compare different languages. Unfortunately, I'm not a very good linguist, and trying to learn 5 exotic languages at my age is not a practical solution. But I do hope I can get some ethnologists, social anthropologists to visit me, listen to what I'm saying, and to go look and see if they can find the same thing in their people out in the field. The third way does seem to be one I can do something about, and that is to see how these ideas develop in children. If we've taken them apart properly, then you can make some fairly shrewd guesses as to how what would be easiest for the children to acquire first. And at the present time, I'm reading as rapidly as I can through an enormous literature in what's called child language. And as of the summer of 1973, I expect to have a laboratory here at the Rockefeller University in which we can have children in and see what they say. I mean literally see with video recording equipment, and do some careful analyses of what is going on. To take an example, many adults have a good deal of trouble keeping left and right straight. And it's not quite clear why that should be the case. And I've heard various theories about the 2 sides of the brain competing or something of that sort. I don't think it's like that at all. I think the system by which we assign left and right, the linguistic system, is enormously complex, and it hasn't been analyzed until fairly recently. Work by Bierwisch in East Germany, work by Charles Fillmore, and some of the things that we've been doing have now produced a fairly clear picture of how it goes. You see, in the world there are objects that have intrinsic parts, and there are objects that don't have intrinsic parts. A rock doesn't have any intrinsic parts. If you ask what is the top of a rock, it's whatever part of the rock is uppermost at the moment, and you roll it over and a different part is top. But if you ask about a table, Whereas the top of the table, it doesn't matter what orientation the table is in, it has an intrinsic top. You turn the table over and the top is on the bottom, and what do children make of that? I wish I knew. Now, of those objects that have tops, and I'll leave out of consideration such things as arrows and bullets, which have fronts without having tops, of those things that have tops, some of them have intrinsic fronts. A table has an intrinsic top, but it doesn't have an intrinsic front. A desk, however, has both an intrinsic top and an intrinsic front. An automobile has an intrinsic top and an intrinsic front. Now, if something has both an intrinsic top and an intrinsic front, then it'll have an intrinsic left and right side. So we're gradually closing in on left and right. But of those things that have an intrinsic top and have an intrinsic front, there are two different ways of assigning left and right. There are things like your desk, in which your characteristic orientation is facing toward the desk, where the left side of the desk is that side of the desk that's opposite your left hand as you face toward the desk. But the chair in which you sit at your desk is something that you orient yourself inside of. So the left arm of the chair is that arm of the chair which is opposite your right hand as you stand facing the chair. So in addition to learning which things have intrinsic tops and of those which things have intrinsic fronts, you must then learn which of those things you orient yourself toward face on and which you orient yourself inside of. Now, once a child has learned all that and knows which is his right hand, that is, after all, the price of admission to this game, he can then assign left and right correctly in one half of the system of spatial designations that we have in English. The other part is for objects without intrinsic parts, in which case you have something that linguists call deixis, or philosophers following C.S. Peirce call indexicals. That is, you have to be in the situation at the time in order to know which side of a thing the speaker intends from his point of view. Now that's an elaborate, terribly elaborate system. And we don't know how children acquire that. One thing I'm quite sure of after watching some elementary school teachers is that nobody teaches it to them. I've seen teachers scold children in elementary school for not getting the idea of top right. And the teacher not understanding that she was defining top as the uppermost part, whereas the child was defining top as an intrinsic top, which is a much more complicated system. The child had mastered the complicated system. The teacher didn't understand the difference. So somehow the children managed to learn it in spite of what we teach them, and it's really rather wonderful. I'd like to understand it better.
The study of language is something that, and meaning and all these other things you've been talking about, something which one naturally becomes very interested in as soon as one starts to write computer programs, or as soon as one starts to use computers in a conversational or semi-conversational way. Do you find, in fact, that that your interest in linguistics predated your interest in communication with computers, or was it the other way around?
I don't know which came first. I really don't. I grew up around Harvard and MIT, where computers were being invented. I remember going away, and I spent a term at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study, where von Neumann was working on his programs at the time. It was always just sort of part of my background to know about computers and to be interested in them.
Anyway, did you know von Neumann at all well?
Yes, von Neumann was my sponsor for the time I was at the Institute for Advanced Study in 1950. And I spent my whole time there working on Markov processes, that is, these models of transitional probabilities that I mentioned earlier. And toward the end of the time, I decided that I really should go in and talk to Professor von Neumann. He allowed me an appointment, and I went in, and he said, what do you want? And I didn't want anything, so I said, well, you know, I've been working on these transitional probability things. Oh, yes, he says, that's due to a theorem of Frobenius. The man talked like a machine gun, and in 5 minutes he traced the whole development of these ideas I'd spent 5 months trying to understand, and he rattled through it, deriving theorems as he went when he couldn't remember them. And at the end of it, he stopped and he said, is that what you've been working on? And I said, yes. And he said, well, that's good. Now, what do you want from me? Well, I was stumped again. I stammered, well, now, do you think this would have any applicability to psychology? Oh, he said, I don't know anything about psychology. And with that, the interview ended. That was my exposure to Professor von Neumann, who is certainly one of the most stimulating, exciting people I think I've ever read or known anything about.
I've always felt it a little disappointing that psychologists as a group haven't paid more attention to computers, not merely as tools for working out the results of complicated experimental procedures, but to consider the new concepts and the new ideas about the nature of the mind and the nature of thinking, which are likely to come as we continue to develop more and more sophisticated and clever machines.
Well, the psychologists are beginning to get interested in the subtler aspects of computers, and if you pick up almost any journal that publishes articles on cognitive psychology, perceptual psychology, you'll find it now full of flowcharts, which you wouldn't have seen 15, 20 years ago. I think that the subtler things that are coming along in the computer business that psychologists should be most interested in, however, have more to do with programming languages than they have to do with the design of hardware. The machine, if it's a good machine, a big machine, is a general purpose instrument that will do anything that you tell it to do. And so you write a program that makes it do the kinds of things that you're interested in, that gives shape to the machine. And people have, of course, tried to simulate the kind of information processing that people do, that is to give shape to the machine that is vaguely in the image and likeness of man, although that work, I feel, has been more disappointing than I had expected when I first heard of it. It's gone more slowly. The whole problem has turned out to be much more difficult than we anticipated in the early flush of enthusiasm. I think that the simple models that come from the early days of computing, we've just about worked our way through, and a number of psychologists, particularly experimental psychologists interested in the fine-grained details of perceptual or short-term memory processing of information, have now worked through any kind of model, any kind of simple model that you might borrow from computers or computer programming. But there are more complex ideas coming along. One of the notions that I found very stimulating in thinking about how people process sentences as they hear them is the notion of compilation. The computer, of course, works in rather simple commands. It's very hard to think about complex problems in terms of such simple commands, and therefore higher level languages, programming languages, problem-oriented programming languages have been invented so that you can talk more directly about your problem to the computer. And what you must do in running such things, if you're not on an interactive system, is write your program in some higher level language like Fortran, say, or ALGOL, and then your first run through is to compile the program, that is to translate that into the kind of lower level machine instructions that the machine can do something about. Now, if you take that as a metaphor, it might well be that the English language or the German or the French or the Russian or whatever is a form of higher level programming language, and that what you must do in order to understand it is essentially to compile a program of instructions that your nervous system can execute. Having compiled the program of instructions, you must then decide whether you wish to execute it or not. Incidentally, that pause between compilation and execution is a very characteristic feature of human behavior, and one that's hard for a behaviorist to cope with. If you're supposed to have a stimulus to which you make a response, when you get into language systems, you stimulus to which there is no overt response, or there may be a modulation of response that occurs a month later. And how are you ever to track down which stimulus led to which response? But suppose you think of it as being compiled with a decision as to whether or not to execute it. That is, if I ask you how much is 4 plus 5, you probably execute that almost involuntarily. But if I ask you how much is 3,862 multiplied by 416, even though you understand perfectly what I'm asking you, the chance that you would execute that involuntarily is minimal. Most of us would have to go through quite an elaborate execution process with pencil and paper, or perhaps a computing machine, before we were willing to provide an answer to that one. And if you imagine that the compilation is practically automatic, that is, that you cannot refuse to understand a sentence that comes to you in a language that you know well, the real pause that gives you control over what's going on and does not make you a victim of whatever words happen to fall upon you at the moment, that pause between compilation and execution is where psychology really begins to get interesting.
For information about other tapes in the series Audio Colloquies, write to Department of Educational Media, Harper & Row Publishers Incorporated, 10 East 53rd Street, New York, New York, 10022.